The first time Nathan Dalton noticed that Susanna Bristol never cried, even when she had every reason in the world to do so, was the morning her barn burned to the ground and she stood watching it with her hands folded in front of her like a woman in church. That had been 2 years ago, almost to the day, and in all the time since, Nathan had never spoken more than a handful of necessary words to her. Not because he did not want to. Not because he found her dull or difficult or unworthy of conversation. Quite the opposite. He had not spoken to her because every time he came close enough to try, something inside his chest locked up tight as a rusted gate, and all the words he had stored up would scatter like spooked horses, leaving him standing there looking like a fool with his hat in his hands. The town of Caldera Flat, Texas, in the spring of 1878, was not a place that gave a man many excuses to be quiet. It was a rough and living thing, that town, with its single main street packed hard by wagon wheels and boot heels, its saloon that never fully went dark, its general store run by old Hector Prout, who knew everyone's business before they did themselves. The Santa Fe Railroad had pushed a spur line 20 miles to the south 2 years back, and that had brought new people, new money, and new trouble in equal measure. Caldera Flat sat at the edge of the hill country, where the limestone bluffs gave way to long, sweeping grassland that ran south toward the Nueces River, and if you stood on the roof of the livery stable on a clear morning, you could see far enough that the horizon looked like a painting of something holy. Nathan's property and Susanna's property shared a long fence line that ran due east for nearly 3/4 of a mile along the ridge. He ran cattle. She ran cattle too, though her herd was smaller, and she grew a kitchen garden behind her house that was the most orderly and productive piece of land Nathan had ever seen. He had watched her work that garden from a respectful distance more times than he would ever admit. He told himself he was checking his fence line. He told himself a lot of things. Susanna Bristol had come to Caldera Flat in the autumn of 1876 with her husband, Thomas Bristol, a man of some ambition and a great deal of debt that nobody in town had known about until after he was dead. Thomas had taken sick with fever that first winter and was in the ground before the bluebonnets came up in March of 1877. He left Susanna with 160 acres, a small herd, a mortgage held by the bank in San Antonio, and a reputation as a widow woman who did not need anyone's help, which she had built entirely by refusing it every time it was offered. She was 27 years old and she worked like she had been doing it her whole life. She repaired her own fences. She pulled her own calves in the spring. She drove her own cattle to the stock pens on sale days, and she negotiated prices with the buyers with a calm, level stare that made grown men look at their boots. Nathan had watched her do it. He had stood 20 feet away at the sale pens on more than one occasion, and felt something that started as admiration and grew, over the long, slow months, into something far more complicated and far more terrifying. Nathan Dalton was 31 years old. He had come to Caldera Flat in 1874, after 4 years working cattle drives up the Kishom Trail, 3 years in which he had learned that sleeping on the ground and eating dust was a young man's work, and one particular year in which a man named Jed Purvis had cheated him out of $60 in a card game in Abilene, and he had decided then that the life of a drover, however free it felt, was not the life he wanted. He had bought his land with money saved from 7 years of wages, 320 acres with a good creek, and a house that needed more work than he had initially understood. He had done that work himself mostly, with help from his neighbor to the west, a Tejano rancher named Alejandro Vega, who had been running cattle on that land since before Texas was Texas, and who treated Nathan with the kind of careful, watchful generosity that a man gives to someone he is not yet sure about, but is willing to give the benefit of the doubt. Alejandro Vega had his own history of watching Anglo settlers arrive and claim land that had once belonged to his family in ways that were rarely fair and rarely kind, and the fact that he and Nathan had come to something like genuine friendship was a thing Nathan did not take lightly. Alejandro had taught him which grasses held through a dry summer and which springs went bad in August, and in return, Nathan had helped him push his cattle through a river crossing 3 autumns in a row when the water ran high. They ate supper together 2 or 3 times a month, and Alejandro's wife Rosa made tamales that Nathan thought were probably the best food he had ever put in his mouth. But it was Susanna Bristol, on the other side of that long fence line to the east, who occupied a place in Nathan's thoughts that he could not seem to clear out no matter how much hard work he threw at the problem. He knew things about her that she had never told him directly, because Caldera Flat was a small place and people talked, and because Nathan was a careful observer of everything around him even when he pretended otherwise. He knew she had grown up in Georgia, somewhere in the hill country near Dalonga, and that she had a sister still there whom she wrote letters to on the first Sunday of every month. He knew she could read and had been educated, because he had seen her reading to the Prout children on Saturday afternoons outside the general store. He knew she made her coffee stronger than almost anyone he had ever met, because the smell of it drifted over on still mornings when the wind was right, and it was an extraordinarily good smell. He knew she sang to herself when she thought no one was near, old hymns mostly, in a low voice that was not quite a trained voice but was entirely honest, and that honesty made it more beautiful than anything practiced. He had never told her any of this. He had never found the way to begin. Their interactions over 2 years had been limited to the kind of polite acknowledgement that neighbors exchange when they happen to meet at a fence line or at Prout's store. He would tip his hat. She would nod. He had once helped her pull a calf that was stuck, arriving at her fence when he heard the cow in distress at dusk, and they had worked together in near silence for 40 minutes, and when the calf was down and breathing and the cow was standing and satisfied, Susanna had looked at him and said, "Thank you, Mr. Dalton," in a voice that was steady and warm, and Nathan had said, "Happy to," and then walked back to his own land in the gathering dark feeling like a man who had just been handed something precious and immediately dropped it. He thought about that interaction with a regularity that embarrassed him. There were other men in Caldera Flat who had shown interest in Susanna Bristol. That was not a surprise. She was a handsome woman, dark-haired and gray-eyed with a quality of stillness that some men found unsettling and others found entirely magnetic. A man named Corbin Marsh, who ran a large cattle operation east of town and had more money than manners, had ridden out to her place twice in the spring of 1877 with what Nathan recognized as courting intentions dressed up in business language. Susanna had received him both times with perfect politeness and had sent him away with nothing to show for it. Nathan had watched from his side of the fence, pretending to inspect a post, and had felt something he was not proud of but could not entirely suppress. Relief, mostly, and something that was not quite jealousy but lived in the same neighborhood. Doc Haverson's son, a young man named Percy who had come out from St. Louis in the summer of 1877 to help his father and who was full of energy and had a fine new horse and very white teeth, had also tried. He had brought Susanna wildflowers, which Nathan observed from his fence with a feeling like a stone settling in his chest. Susanna had thanked Percy Haverson kindly and given him some of her green tomatoes in exchange, which was a thing that could be interpreted multiple ways, but the flowers never appeared again at her door, and Percy eventually directed his attentions toward the hotel keeper's daughter on the other side of town. Nathan told himself he was relieved because it meant Susanna was managing her own affairs without complications. He told himself this and did not examine it too hard. The spring of 1878 came in dry and then went wet, which was the way of things in the hill country. Nathan spent April mending fence in the northwest corner of his property, where a section had gone down over the winter, and he spent May moving his cattle to the south pasture, where the grass was knee-high after the April rains. He saw Susanna at Prout's store twice in those 2 months, and once from a distance when she was riding her fence line on her roan mare, checking the posts with a methodical attention that Nathan recognized as the work of someone who trusted no one else to do the thing right. He spent the evening of the 15th of May sitting on his front porch watching the light leave the sky and listening to the coyotes starting up in the cedar breaks to the west, and he had what he would later think of, with some embarrassment, as a formal conversation with himself about Susanna Bristol. He had acknowledged, in the privacy of that conversation, that he was in love with a woman he had never properly spoken to. He had acknowledged that this was a foolish situation. He had resolved, not for the first time, to do something about it. He had sat there in the falling dark and made himself a promise that the next time he saw her at a reasonable distance he would walk over and say something real, something that was not just pleasantry, something that began a conversation instead of closing one off. He had made this resolution before. He was aware of that. But this time, he told himself, he meant it. The summer arrived in Caldera Flat with the specific fury of a Texas summer that has decided to be serious. By the first week of June, the creek on Nathan's property had dropped 2 feet, and the grass in the south pasture was beginning to look tired. He watered his garden by hand from the creek, hauling buckets in the early morning before the heat built, and he watched his cattle with the attention of a man who knows that summer in that country is not something you take for granted. Across the fence line, he could see Susanna doing the same things. She was out before dawn most mornings, and he could sometimes see the lantern light moving in her barn while his own was still dark. She had 6 working cattle dogs, mixed breeds that she had trained herself to a degree of precision that impressed the men in town who watched livestock professionally. Those dogs kept her small herd tight and orderly in a way that made up considerably for the labor she could not afford to hire. Nathan had 2 ranch hands, brothers named Gil and Emmett Stokes, who had been with him since his first year. They were reliable and quiet and did their work without requiring much management, which Nathan appreciated. He paid them fair wages and they ate supper with him 3 nights a week, and the arrangement suited everyone. On a Thursday morning in the second week of June, Nathan rode out to check his east fence and found a section of 3 posts down, wire cut clean, which was not a thing that happened naturally. He stood looking at it for a long moment, his horse standing patient behind him, and he read the ground around the break. There were boot prints in the soft soil near the creek crossing, and the prints of cattle moving east through the gap. His cattle, moving east, meant they had gone onto Susanna's property. He rode back to the barn, told Gil to take the fence materials and go start the repair, and rode east along the fence line to find his cattle and, unavoidably, to speak to Susanna Bristol. He found 8 of his steers contentedly grazing in her south pasture, and he found Susanna already there, on foot, her dogs sitting at perfect attention at her sides, watching the cattle with an expression that was impossible to read. Nathan pulled up his horse at the fence line and swung down, and she looked up at him, and there was a brief moment where neither of them spoke. "Your fence is down," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact delivered with a kind of calm directness that he had come to think of as characteristic of everything she did. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I have a man on the repair. I am sorry for the trouble. I will get them out of your pasture now." "They have not done any harm," she said. "The grass is good over here. I would not call it trouble." He looked at her. She was wearing a plain work dress in a faded blue that had been washed so many times it had gone soft at the edges, and her dark hair was pinned up but not entirely successfully, which meant she had done it herself in the early morning with no mirror and had been at work for several hours since. There was a streak of red clay on her forearm from where she had evidently been in the creek bed already today, and she was looking at his cattle with an expression of something very close to amusement. "Someone cut the wire," Nathan said, because it seemed important for her to know. She looked at him then fully and her gray eyes sharpened. "Cut it. Clean cuts, posts pulled out. It was not an accident." She was quiet for a moment. "Have you had trouble before?" "Nothing like this," she nodded slowly. I have had 2 fence sections go down in the last month, she said. I thought it was weather or animals or just age, but 2 sections and now yours. She paused. Someone is making a point. I have an idea who, Nathan said, and he did. Corbin Marsh had been after both their properties for 2 years, wanting to expand east and north. He had made Susanna an offer for her land 6 months ago that she had refused, and he had made Nathan an offer the following month that Nathan had also refused, and Marsh had not taken either refusal with the graciousness of a man who was secure in his position. Corbin Marsh, Susanna said, which was not a question. I would think so, Nathan said. She looked back at the cattle. She was quiet for another moment, and Nathan stood there and held his hat and waited, which was a thing he was good at, holding the hat and waiting, and he thought that if he could ever just stop doing those things and start talking like a normal person, his life might go considerably better. I cannot prove it, she said, and Sheriff Alderman would want proof. No, Nathan agreed. I cannot prove it either. He hesitated. But if it keeps happening, we might want to speak to Alderman together. 2 neighbors reporting the same problem carries more weight than one. She looked at him again, and this time the look lasted long enough that Nathan became aware of it as a look and not just a glance, and something in it was measuring him in a way that he thought was probably deserved, given that they had been neighbors for 2 years, and he had never offered her anything more substantial than a tip of his hat. That is a reasonable suggestion, she said finally. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Nathan, he said, and then was briefly alarmed at himself for having said it. She looked at him. Nathan, she repeated, and the way she said it, just his name, just those 2 syllables, did something entirely unreasonable to the region of his chest. Then you will call me Susanna. Yes, ma'am, he said. Susanna, she almost smiled. I will help you get your cattle back through the fence, she said, and she turned and whistled 2 short notes at her dogs, and they came alive like shadows given purpose. And together, in a companionable silence that felt entirely different from the silences that had come before it, they moved his 8 wandering steers back through the gap in the fence. When the cattle were back on his side, and the gap was being repaired by Gil Stokes, who arrived with posts and wire at just the right moment, and had the good sense not to say anything that was not purely practical, Nathan stood at the fence line and looked at Susanna, and thought that he had just done the most useful thing he had managed to do in 2 years, and it had taken 8 escaped steers to accomplish it. I will check my fence line today, she said. If I find another cut section, I will send word. Do, he said, and if I find anything else on my end, I will come and tell you directly. She nodded. She turned to go and then paused and looked back over her shoulder. That calf you helped me pull last spring, she said. He is a good one. I named him something ridiculous. I call him March. Nathan did not know exactly why that was the thing that finally loosened the locked place in his chest a little. Maybe it was the admission of the ridiculous name, said with perfect dry composure, or maybe it was just the fact of her offering something small and personal that she had not needed to offer. But he laughed, a real laugh, and she looked at him with those gray eyes and her mouth curved, and then she turned and walked back toward her own land, and Nathan stood there at his fence holding his hat, and feeling something that was entirely too large to fit inside an ordinary Thursday morning. July in that part of Texas arrived with a heaviness in the air that signaled the kind of summer that old-timers talked about in specific terms, comparing it to years of drought and heat that had broken families and driven cattle to their knees. The creek on Nathan's property dropped further. He moved cattle to the north pasture, where a spring-fed tank held water through most summers. He told Gil and Emmett to check the tank level every morning and report. He also found 2 more sections of fence down, both on his east line. One was clearly cut. One was more ambiguous. He rode to Susanna's place each time, not because protocol demanded it, but because he had made a promise, and because he wanted to, and each time Susanna came out to meet him at the fence, and they spoke with the easy directness of people who have recently decided to stop pretending. She had found 1 more cut section herself. They rode together to see Sheriff Alderman on the last Tuesday of July, riding side by side the 3 miles into town on the flat road that followed the limestone ridge. And Susanna rode the roan mare and Nathan rode his bay gelding, and they rode close enough that he could sometimes hear her voice clearly without raising it over the wind. Alderman was a careful man, neither bad nor particularly good, the kind of lawman that a town like Caldera Flat tended to produce. He listened to their account with the attention of someone who is doing the minimum necessary work of his job, and he said that without proof of who was cutting the fence there was not much he could formally do, but that he would pay Marsh a visit and make it known that the complaints had been registered. Susanna accepted this with her characteristic composure. Nathan accepted it with slightly less composure, but he kept that to himself. On the ride back, Susanna said, "He will not do enough." "No," Nathan agreed. "Marsh will push until there is a consequence he can feel." She was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "I am not going to sell. He should know that." "He knows it," Nathan said. "That is why the fence." She glanced at him. "Are you going to sell?" "No," Nathan said, and there was nothing complicated about that answer. She nodded as if she had expected it. "Then we watch each other's fence lines," she said, "and we document what we find. And when Marsh makes a mistake that leaves a mark, we are ready." Nathan looked at her, riding straight-backed on the roan mare in the July heat with the calm certainty of a woman who has already decided how this ends, and he thought, "I have been living beside this woman for 2 years. I have been afraid of her without knowing why, and she is the least frightening person I have ever met." What she was, he understood then, was serious. She was entirely serious, which was a quality Nathan had spent his life respecting and had only rarely found in another person. Through August, they fell into a pattern. He would check his east fence in the mornings, and she would check her west fence in the mornings. And sometimes they met at the fence line in the middle, and talked for 10 minutes or 20 minutes about cattle prices and water levels and the behavior of Corbin Marsh and the weather and a dozen other things. And those conversations were some of the best 20 minutes Nathan could remember stringing together in years. He found out that she had been afraid, genuinely afraid, in her first year on the property alone after Thomas died, not of the work but of the isolation, the specific kind of loneliness that comes when you are surrounded by people, but none of them know what is actually happening inside you. She told him this on a morning in early August when they were both leaning on the fence rail and looking at the hills in the west going gold in the early light. And she told it the way she told most things, without self-pity, just as a fact that had been true and was less true now. He told her about the Kishom Trail, about the specific beauty of the Kansas prairie at dawn when the grass was wet and the light was just breaking, and about the loneliness of that work, which was different from any other kind of loneliness because you were never physically alone, and yet there was nobody in any of those camps who knew anything real about you. He had not talked about the trail to anyone in years, and he found that talking about it to Susanna was easy, almost embarrassingly easy, like a door that had been stuck for a long time suddenly swinging open on its own. She told him about Georgia, about her father, who had been a farmer and a reader, who had read to her and her sister from whatever books he could find or borrow, and who had died when she was 19, and about the particular grief of losing a parent who was also your primary companion in the life of the mind. Nathan listened to all of it and felt the shape of her becoming clearer to him, like a landscape that had been in haze clearing as you ride toward it. Alejandro Vega came to supper one evening in late August and sat across from Nathan at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "You are different lately." "I am the same," Nathan said. Alejandro smiled, which was a slow, entirely knowing smile that had the quality of something ancient and patient. "You are not the same," he said. "You are lighter, like a man who has been carrying a pack and has finally put it on the ground for a while." Nathan looked at him. "The widow Bristol," Alejandro said, and it was not a question. "We have been talking more," Nathan said, which was the most he was willing to offer. "Talking more," Alejandro said, and his tone made it clear that he considered this an admirable understatement. "She is a good woman. Her land is well run. Her cattle are healthy." He picked up his coffee cup. "And you have been in love with her since approximately 6 weeks after she arrived, which anyone with eyes could see." Nathan said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "It was closer to 8 weeks." Alejandro laughed, a full and genuine laugh that filled Nathan's kitchen, and Nathan laughed too, and it was a good evening overall. September came in cooler and the grass improved, and Nathan's cattle put weight on that he had been worried they would not manage through the summer. He and Susanna continued their morning conversations at the fence line, and they rode into town together 3 more times on various business. And once she came over to his side of the fence to look at a sick calf he was concerned about, and they stood in his barn in the lantern light with the calf between them while she checked its eyes and its gums and its breathing and said, "It needs more fluids and less heat. Keep it in the barn for 3 days." And she was right, as she generally was about cattle. After the calf business, he walked her back to the fence in the dark, and at the fence she paused and said, "Your barn is better organized than mine." "I doubt that," he said. "I saw your barn the evening we pulled March, everything in its place." She looked at him with an expression that he was getting better at reading, and what this one said was that she was pleased and trying not to show it. "You noticed." "I notice things," he said, and then he thought, "Well, that is the most honest thing I have said, and she seems to be taking it well." She nodded and went through the fence and walked back toward her house, and Nathan stood at the fence until her lantern reached her porch and she went inside. October was golden and cool, and the morning smelled of cedar and dry grass and wood smoke from the chimneys of the town, and Nathan woke up every morning with the specific alertness of a man who has something to look forward to, which was a feeling he had not had in a long time. He had not kissed her. He had not told her anything directly about what he felt. He was aware that he was moving towards something, and he was not moving fast enough. But he did not know how to move faster without becoming someone he was not, and he was afraid of what would happen if he said it wrong. Susanna, for her part, gave him nothing that he could read as definitely more than the warmth of genuine friendship, and yet there was something in the way she looked at him sometimes that lived on the border of something else, and he was afraid to cross that border without being invited and more afraid of never being invited. Corbin Marsh made his next move in the first week of October. It was not more fence cutting. He came in with lawyers. Nathan found out from Pruitt at the store that Marsh was filing a claim, with the county saying that the original survey of Susanna's east boundary was incorrect, and that 15 acres of her best pasture land actually belonged to Marsh based on an old original land grant that predated the Republic of Texas. This was the kind of claim that took money to fight and time to fight, and even if you won, it cost you, and Marsh knew it. Nathan rode to Susanna's place directly from Pruitt's store, which was the first time he had arrived at her front door rather than at the fence line, and he stood on her porch and knocked, and she opened the door and looked at him and said, "You have heard about the survey claim." "Pruitt told me," he said. "How long have you known?" "The county recorder rode out this morning," she said. "Come in." He came in for the first time. Her house was small and clean, and it smelled of coffee and something baking, and there were books stacked on a shelf beside the fireplace, more books than he had expected, which he noted and stored away. She had a table and 2 chairs and a braided rug on the floor and a single curtain on the window that she had made herself from flower sacking dyed a pale blue, and it was entirely one of the most welcoming rooms he had ever stood in. She poured him coffee and sat down across from him and said, "Tell me what you know." He told her what Pruitt had told him, and she listened with her hands wrapped around her cup and her eyes steady. When he finished, she said, "The 15 acres he is claiming include my best water access and my south pasture. If he gets them, I lose roughly a third of my reliable grazing land." "He knows exactly what he is taking," Nathan said. "He does." She was quiet for a moment. "I have the original deed from when Thomas and I bought the land. I have the survey that was done in the fall of 1876 before we built. I will need to find a lawyer." "There is a man in San Antonio," Nathan said. James Whitfield. He handled a boundary dispute for Alejandro Vega 3 years ago and he was good. He won. She looked at him. That would not be cheap. No, Nathan said carefully. But if you lose that pasture, the cost of that over years is considerably more. She nodded. She was calculating, he could see, in the way she always did, with a kind of methodical honesty about what the numbers actually were. I will write to Whitfield, she said. And I will send for a copy of the original county survey records. Marsh may be betting that I cannot afford to fight. He would be wrong. Nathan looked at her across the table, the coffee between them, the morning light coming through the flour sack curtain and making everything soft, and he thought, I want to say something. I want to say that she does not have to do this alone. He wanted to say it in a way that was honest and not too much. He could not quite find the words. If you need anything from me, he said finally, testimony about the fence line, records of my own survey, anything, you have it. She looked at him for a long moment and something shifted in her expression, something that was not calculation and not composure but something warmer and less guarded. Thank you, she said. That is more than I expected. Why would you not expect it, he said. Because you do not know me that well, she said, but her voice said that she was not entirely sure this was still true. He rode home in the October sun and sat on his porch that evening and watched the sky go purple and orange in the west and thought about everything that was stored up in him and how it was getting harder to keep it stored. November was when the trouble with Marsh got worse before it got better. Whitfield the lawyer came from San Antonio and reviewed the documents and said the claim was weak but not worthless, and that Marsh had found a clerk in the county seat who was willing to interpret an old Spanish land grant in Marsh's favor, and that this would need to be challenged properly, and the challenge would take time. But November was also when Nathan began to understand something that he had been building toward for months without quite seeing it. He had started going to Susanna's for supper on Sunday evenings. This had begun as a practical arrangement involving the discussion of the legal situation, and it had become something else entirely within 2 weeks, which they both knew and neither of them had formally acknowledged. She cooked with the same economy and precision that she brought to everything, and she set the table with a care that suggested she thought the occasion was worth doing right, and they ate and talked and stayed at the table long after the food was gone, talking about books she had read and things he had seen on the trail, and the nature of the hill country in winter, and every other thing they could find to talk about, which turned out to be an enormous number of things. He brought firewood when he came, not because she asked him but because it seemed like the right thing, and she accepted it without the kind of elaborate protest that some people would have offered, just a simple thank you, which he appreciated because elaborate protests were exhausting. On the last Sunday of November, the sky had been heavy all day with the specific quality of clouds that in Texas signals either a cold front or a thunderstorm or occasionally both at once. Nathan had ridden over with firewood and stayed for supper, and they had talked well past the point when he should have ridden home, and when he finally stood to go and went to the window to check the sky, the clouds had built into something very dark and very serious to the northwest, and the air had gone still in the way that Nathan had learned, over years in that country, to pay attention to. I should get back, he said, but he said it with some doubt. Susanna came to the window beside him and looked at the sky. She was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her standing there. That is coming fast, she said. It is, he agreed. You can stay here, she said. The barn is solid. Your horse will be safe. He stood looking at the sky and knew she was right. The northwest sky was going from dark to the specific greenish-black that meant something serious was on its way, and it was on its way soon. He looked at it and thought, this is not a storm you ride home in. I would be obliged, he said. The storm hit an hour later. It hit with the full fury of a Texas November norther, which is a thing that does not politely announce itself, but arrives at full speed and full volume. The wind dropping the temperature 20 degrees in less than 30 minutes, lightning making the sky electric, thunder arriving not as distant rolls, but as immediate concussions that shook the windows of Susanna's house and made the horses in the barn sound very unhappy indeed. The rain came horizontal, driven by a wind that was doing 60 miles an hour at least, and the sound of it on the roof was something between music and violence. Susanna had lit all her lamps. She had moved away from the windows and was sitting at the table with her hands around a fresh cup of coffee, entirely composed, while outside the world was going sideways, and Nathan stood at the window for a while watching the lightning illuminate the hills and then turned and sat down across from her because there was nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. "You get storms like this often in Georgia?" he asked. "We had rain," she said, "but not this. This is a different thing entirely." "The first one I saw out here nearly knocked me off my horse," he said. "I was on the trail, north of San Antonio, and one of these northers came in without warning and turned the afternoon into midnight in about 15 minutes. Half the cattle ran. Took 2 days to find them all." She smiled, and in the lamplight it was a smile that was entirely unguarded, the kind you see in people when they have forgotten to be careful, and it went straight to some deep place in Nathan that had been waiting for exactly that. The storm threw something against the side of the house, a branch or a piece of roofing from somewhere, and Susanna did not flinch, just looked at the wall and then back at Nathan. "When the barn burned," he said, and then stopped. He had not planned to bring that up. It was 2 years ago, and it was her first year here, and Thomas had just died, and Nathan had stood on his side of the fence in the early morning, watching the barn burn and watching Susanna stand there with her hands folded, and had done nothing except make sure the fire did not cross to his land, which was the most shameful thing he had done in recent memory. She looked at him. "When the barn burned," she said, inviting him to continue. "I watched you stand there," he said. "In the morning when it was still going, and I did not come over. I told myself you did not want strangers, that you had people coming from town, that you were handling it." He paused. "I have thought about that morning a lot." She was quiet for a moment. "I had people from town," she said. "The Pruitts came. Rosa Vega came. I was all right." "That is not what I am saying," he said. She looked at him steadily. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I should have come," he said. "I am saying that I have been your neighbor for 2 years and I have not behaved like a neighbor ought to. I have tipped my hat and stayed on my side of the fence and told myself that was respect for your independence. And I think some of it was that, and some of it was cowardice." The storm outside was producing a kind of constant roar that required him to speak slightly more loudly than he normally would, which meant there was no possibility of anything being quiet or tentative about this conversation. The storm had taken the tentativeness out of it. That was perhaps why he was saying it. "Cowardice," she said. "That is a strong word for a man who crossed into my pasture at dusk to help pull a calf." "That was practical," he said. "The cow was in distress." "And the fence," she said, "and coming to tell me about Marsh and Whitfield and riding to the sheriff and the firewood," and she paused and looked at him with those gray eyes in the lamplight while the storm raged outside and said, "Nathan, I'm not keeping a ledger. I'm not the kind of woman who holds a man accountable for 2 years of shyness." He stared at her. Shyness. What would you call it? He thought about it. "Terror," he said honestly. She blinked once. Then her expression did something complex and quiet that he could not fully read. "Terror," she said. "You are the most," he stopped. He started again. "You are the most capable and serious and honest person I have met since I came to this country. And you have been through things that most people would have broken under, and you have not broken. And every time I have come to your fence with something to say, I have been afraid that whatever I said would be insufficient." The wind hit the house so hard the lamps guttered, and outside there was a crack of thunder that felt like the sky splitting. And Susanna sat at her table and looked at him, and Nathan looked back at her, and the storm seemed to him like something that had been waiting for a specific moment to arrive and had now arrived. "Insufficient," she said quietly, and her voice was different now than it had been a few minutes ago, lower and with something in it that was not quite steady. "I have been in love with you," he said, because the storm was making it impossible to be indirect, and because he had been carrying it for so long that it was coming out whether he found the perfect words or not, for a long time. More than a year, probably longer than that. And I have spent that time finding very elaborate reasons to stand at your fence and not say it. The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as the pause between a lightning strike and the thunder that follows it, which is the kind of silence that stops time. Then Susanna Bristol stood up from her table, walked around it, and stood in front of him, and she was close enough that he could see the lamplight reflected in her gray eyes and the slight irregularity of her breathing, and she said, "Nathan Dalton, you have been the most frustrating neighbor I have ever had in my life." He was very still. "I am sorry," he said. "I am not asking for an apology," she said. "I am telling you that I have been standing at that fence hoping you would say something real for approximately 14 months, and you chose a thunderstorm." "The thunderstorm helped," he said. She looked at him, and then the corner of her mouth moved, and it was not quite a smile, but it was the thing that happens just before one, and Nathan reached up and took her hand, which was the bravest thing he had done in years and felt like it, and her fingers curled around his without hesitation. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." But her voice when she said it had gone entirely warm, and there was nothing in it but the warmth. The storm raged outside for another 3 hours. They sat at her table and they talked, and Nathan held her hand across the table and neither of them let go. And they talked about things they had never said to anyone, the specific shape of their losses and their hopes and their fears, and the things they wanted from the life they were each building on this hard, beautiful country. Susanna talked about Thomas with the honesty of a woman who had loved her husband and grieved him properly, and had come out the other side of that grief with a clear understanding of what she needed next. And Nathan listened, and did not try to fill the space that Thomas had occupied, because that was not his space to fill, and he understood that. He told her about a woman he had wanted to marry when he was 22, a woman in Kansas City who had chosen another man with more money and a roof that did not leak, and how he had come to understand that what he had felt for her was the wanting of someone young who equates longing with love, and how this, what he felt now, was nothing like that. This was recognition. This was the specific feeling of finally arriving somewhere you have been trying to get to for a long time. Susanna listened to all of it with her head tilted slightly and her eyes on him, and when he finished she said, "I did not know you had all of that in you." "I have had no one to say it to," he said. She squeezed his hand. "You have someone now," she said. He stayed in her barn that night on account of the storm, as agreed, and he lay in the hay listening to the wind come down, and the rain slow and the horses settle, and he was too awake to sleep and did not mind. In the morning the sky was washed clean and cold and blue as glass, the way Texas skies go after a serious storm has moved through, and Susanna was already up and had coffee made when he came in from the barn, and she handed him a cup and they stood at her window and looked at the cleaned world together. "I am going to come to your fence this morning in my own proper fashion," he said, "and ask you if you would like to ride into town with me on Saturday." She looked at him sideways. "You can ask me now," she said. "You are already standing in my kitchen." "I know," he said, "but I feel it is important to do it right, given the extended failure of the previous 2 years. She almost laughed. "All right," she said. "Come to my fence on Saturday morning. I will be there." He did come to her fence on Saturday morning, and she was there, and he asked her, hat in hand, if she would ride into town with him, and she said yes. And they rode in together, and everyone in Caldera Flat who saw them together on that Saturday morning took one look, and then looked at each other with the specific expression of people watching something that has finally, after considerable delay, arrived at its obvious destination. Hector Prout said, to his wife Mabel, that he had been waiting for this since approximately March of the previous year. Mabel Prout said she had been waiting since the previous October, and that Hector was, as usual, late to everything. Alejandro Vega saw them riding together and smiled his slow, patient smile, and said nothing at all. December in Caldera Flat was cold and clear, and Nathan and Susanna moved toward each other with the careful, deliberate attention of two people who have spent too long being careful and have not forgotten that, but are now attempting something different. He called on her formally, on Thursday and Sunday evenings, and she received him in the way that a serious woman in 1878 receives a man she is seriously considering, which meant she was always home and always had coffee made, and always had something to talk about that made the time pass so quickly that he was always surprised when the evening was gone. He kissed her for the first time on the porch of her house on the 20th of December, after an evening that had lasted past the time when he should have ridden home and had been entirely unwilling to end. The moon was up and the air was cold enough that their breath showed, and she had come to the porch with him when he went to get his horse, and they had stood there for a moment in the moonlight, and Nathan had looked at her and said, "Susanna, may I?" And she had said, "Yes," before he finished the question. He kissed her in the cold December air, and it was gentle and deliberate, and when he stepped back she looked at him with those gray eyes in the moonlight, and she said, "It is about time." He laughed, and she laughed too, and it was the best sound he had heard on that land. He spent Christmas with her, and with Alejandro and Rosa Vega, who came over with their 3 children and enough food to feed everyone twice, and they ate around Susanna's table, which was too small but nobody minded, and the Vega children ran in the cold yard, and the adults talked around the warmth of the fire. Nathan sat beside Susanna and their hands touched under the table, and Rosa Vega watched this with a face full of pleased satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal, and Alejandro caught Nathan's eye across the table and nodded once, which was the entirety of everything that needed to be said between them. January came with a second hard norther that was not as dramatic as the November one but was thoroughly cold, and Nathan and Susanna spent it in a rhythm of morning fence checks that now had the quality of appointments, and Thursday and Sunday suppers, and 2 or 3 mornings a week where one of them crossed to the other's land for practical reasons that were also not only practical. The survey case moved slowly, as legal things do, but Whitfield was thorough. He found a letter in the county archives from an 1840s surveyor that directly contradicted the interpretation Marsh's people were using, and in late January, he filed the challenge, and it was strong enough that the county recorder's office began to look nervous about the clerk who had approved Marsh's claim. It was in January that Nathan also discovered who had been cutting the fence. One of Marsh's ranch hands, a man named Tuck Briley, got drunk at the saloon and said something to the wrong person about a job he had done that he was not particularly proud of. The word got to Sheriff Alderman within a day, and Alderman, faced with a witness and the earlier complaints on record, finally moved. He brought Briley in, and Briley, faced with the prospect of actual consequences, gave a statement. Marsh was not arrested. He was a man of property, and the law of 1878 in that part of Texas was not inclined to put men of property in difficult positions. But Alderman rode out to Marsh's place and had a conversation that Marsh understood clearly, and the fence cutting stopped. Marsh's survey claim died in March of 1879, when Whitfield presented his evidence to the county, and the challenge succeeded. Susanna received the news on a Tuesday and was not dramatic about it. She came to Nathan's fence in the mid-morning and told him, and he looked at her and saw the relief that she was keeping very controlled, and he said, "I am glad," which was inadequate, but then he reached over the fence and took her hand and said, "I am very glad. You held your ground." "We held it," she said, and the way she said it, the "we," was something that settled in Nathan like the first warm day after a long winter. Spring of 1879 arrived, and the country greened up fast with good rains in April, and Nathan's cattle put on weight, and Susanna's herd expanded with healthy calves, and the grass on both their properties was the best it had been since either of them arrived. Nathan repaired every section of fence on the east line with new posts and new wire, and did it in a way that was meant to last. And Susanna brought him coffee in the morning while he worked and stood by while he was not too proud to accept help pulling wire. And they worked together with the easy competence of two people who have figured out how to occupy the same space without losing themselves in it. He asked her to marry him in May, on the first warm evening of the year that was genuinely warm and not just trying to be. He had ridden over for a Thursday supper, and after they ate they had gone out to sit on her porch in the cooling evening, which was a habit they had developed because the evening light on the hills to the west was consistently one of the most beautiful things Nathan had ever made time to look at. They were sitting side by side in the two chairs she kept on the porch, close enough that their arms touched on the armrests, and Nathan looked out at the hills going gold and then looked at her and said, "I have a question I would like to ask you." She looked at him with a quiet attention that said she knew what was coming. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "I am asking formally, and with the full understanding that you are entirely capable of managing your life without me, which is not the point. The point is that I would like to share your life. I would like to be the person you drink coffee with in the morning and talk to in the evenings, and I would like to know that you are there when I wake up. I have loved you since roughly the first time I saw you standing in a burning morning looking like you could handle anything the world put in front of you, and I would very much like to try to be worthy of that." She looked at him for a moment. The evening light was on her face, and her eyes were bright. "That is a very long way to say yes or no," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am asking yes or no. Will you?" "Yes," she said. "Nathan Dalton, yes." He reached over and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat on the porch in the May evening while the last light left the hills and the coyote started up in the cedar breaks, and the world was quiet and good and entirely sufficient. They were married in June of 1879, in the church in Caldera Flat, which was a small building with not enough pews and a minister named Reverend Cawley, who was a serious man with a genuine gift for the ceremony of things, and every pew was full, and people stood at the back and outside the open doors. Hector and Mabel Prout were there. Alejandro and Rosa Vega and their 3 children were there, Rosa in a beautiful embroidered dress that she had made for the occasion. Doc Haverson was there. Percy Haverson was there, with the hotel keeper's daughter, who was now his wife and who smiled at Susanna with genuine warmth. Sheriff Alderman was there, standing in the back with his hat in his hand. Susanna wore a dress that she had made from a cream-colored fabric that Rosa Vega had helped her choose from the general store, and she had done her hair properly, and it was pinned with a small arrangement of wildflowers that she had cut from her own garden that morning. And when Nathan saw her at the front of the church, he stood there and looked at her and thought, "I have never in my life been this certain of anything." She looked at him when she reached him, and her gray eyes were steady and warm and entirely without doubt. And Reverend Cawley said the words, and they said the words back, and Nathan put a ring on her finger that had belonged to his mother, and that he had carried in his coat pocket for 6 weeks. And when Cawley said he could kiss his bride, Nathan kissed her with the quiet intentness of a man who means what he is doing. And the church erupted into the kind of warm noise that communities make when something has been correctly resolved. They had a supper at Alejandro and Rosa's house that evening, because Rosa had insisted on providing the food, and her house was larger, and Rosa's cooking was something that made everything feel like a celebration. They ate and they danced, Alejandro producing a fiddle that he played with considerable skill, and Nathan danced with Susanna in the lamplight of the Vega house while Alejandro played, and the children fell asleep in chairs, and Rosa sat smiling at the table with her hands wrapped around her cup, and Nathan held his wife and thought the word wife, and found that it fit perfectly. They went home to Susanna's house that night, which they had agreed would be their house, and in the morning Nathan walked his own land with the specific awareness of a man who has 2 places that matter to him, and is figuring out how they fit together. His plan, which he and Susanna had discussed at length, was to move his operation east, combining their two properties into something that was more efficient and more resilient than either alone. Alejandro had approved of this plan. Gil and Emmett Stokes had been told and had expressed no objection to the change. It was a plan that made practical sense and emotional sense, and Nathan was quietly very happy about it. The summer of 1879 was good. The creek stayed high. The cattle did well. The combined herd, which they managed together with a comfortable division of tasks that arose naturally from what each of them was already good at, was the best-performing livestock operation Nathan had been part of in his life. Susanna's dogs were an important reason for this. Her garden expanded to feed two people properly, and Nathan's contribution to the garden was primarily the hauling of water in dry spells and the construction of a better fence around it to keep the cattle out, which he built in a single long day with Gil's help, while Susanna directed from the garden with the authority of someone who knows exactly what she needs. They also dismantled the fence line that had separated their two properties, which Nathan did with a deliberateness that felt meaningful. He pulled each post himself, working from north to south along the line, and Susanna watched for a while from her porch and then came out and walked beside him as he went, and she said nothing, just walked beside him as the old boundary came down. In September of 1879, Susanna told him she was pregnant. He was at the kitchen table when she told him in the morning over coffee, and she said it directly because she did not know another way to say things, and Nathan set down his cup and looked at her and felt something so enormous and entirely unexpected that he sat with it for a moment before he trusted himself to speak. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling fine," she said. "I have been to see Doc Haverson, and he says I am healthy and that everything is as it should be and that the baby will likely come in late April." Nathan stood up from the table and came around it and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was not his most natural mode. He was a man of large hands and practical work, but he had learned a tenderness around her that felt completely genuine, and he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Susanna." "Nathan," she said with a small smile. "I am going to be entirely inadequate at expressing this," he said. "You can try," she said. "I am so happy," he said. "I am so happy I do not know what to do with it." She put her hands over his where they held her face. "You could start by sitting back down and finishing your coffee," she said. "And then you could help me move that stack of lumber from the barn to the east wall, because I want to build another stall before winter, and I cannot move the heavy pieces myself." He laughed and held her face a moment longer, and she let him, and then they finished their coffee and moved the lumber. He wrote a letter to his brother in Missouri, who he had not written to in over a year, and told him he was married and that there was a child coming. He received back a letter that was warm and surprised and full of a genuine happiness that reminded Nathan, reading it, that his brother was someone he should write to more often. He resolved to write monthly and mostly kept it. October was golden again, the second October since the storm, and Nathan took a morning to ride the full perimeter of their combined property, all the fence lines, just to look at it. It was a good piece of country. There was water in the creek and water in the spring-fed tank to the north, and the grass was going to winter in good shape, and the cattle were fat and healthy. He rode the east line, which now had no fence to indicate where his land had ended and hers had begun, and he stopped his horse on the limestone ridge and looked south over the whole of it, and thought about everything that had brought him to this exact spot in this exact life, and it seemed to him like a series of things that had appeared to be random and had turned out not to be. Alejandro Vega rode up beside him, appearing from the cedar breaks to the west in that quiet way he had of arriving without announcement. "Surveying your kingdom," Alejandro said. "Our land," Nathan said. Alejandro looked out over the pastures. "It is good land," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather ran cattle on land just north of here, 40 years ago, before the Republic, before the annexation." He paused. We lost most of it piece by piece over 30 years. What I have now is a fraction of what was ours. He said this without bitterness, in the matter-of-fact way of a man who has made peace with an injustice without pretending it was not an injustice, and Nathan heard it that way and did not offer any hollow comfort. "I am sorry for what was taken," Nathan said. Alejandro looked at him. "I know," he said. "You are a different kind of man than most of the ones who came here." He paused. "That matters." They sat on the ridge for a while in the morning silence, two men on horses looking at the country that had shaped them both, and then Alejandro said, "Rosa wants to know if Susanna is coming on Sunday." "She is," Nathan said. "She has been making something for Rosa. I do not know what it is. She has not told me." "Women," Alejandro said, and his tone was one of pure contentment. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was cold but not brutal, and Susanna moved through her pregnancy with the same calm practicality she brought to everything. She worked the garden and managed the dogs and kept the books for their combined operation with a clarity and organization that made Nathan, who was not a man who particularly enjoyed the bookkeeping side of things, genuinely grateful. Doc Haverson came out in December and marched to check on her, and each time he left satisfied. Rosa Vega visited regularly and was a source of practical knowledge and warm company, and Mabel Prout brought gifts and good intentions, and occasionally too much advice, which Susanna received with such gracious patience that Mabel left feeling that she had been brilliantly helpful, which was a small art that Nathan admired. Nathan's brother came from Missouri in February, a visit that had been planned since October and that Nathan had looked forward to with a mix of excitement and the particular nervousness of wanting someone you care about to be seen well. His brother's name was Carl, and Carl was 2 years older and a solidly built man with Nathan's same dark eyes and a more expressive face. Carl liked Susanna immediately and said so, in his direct Missouri way, and Susanna liked Carl in return with an ease that Nathan felt as a deep relief, and the three of them sat around the table of what had been Susanna's house, and was now theirs, and talked and ate Rosa's tamales that Rosa had sent over specifically, because Nathan had told her his brother was coming, and it was one of the best evenings Nathan could remember. Carl stayed 2 weeks and helped Nathan build an addition on the east side of the house, which they needed with the baby coming, a proper bedroom that let the main room be a proper sitting room instead of everything at once. Carl was a good carpenter, and Nathan was a willing but less skilled one, and Susanna directed from the doorway with specific suggestions that turned out to improve the result considerably. When Carl left, driving north in his wagon, he stopped the wagon and leaned down and shook Nathan's hand and said, "I am glad for you, brother." His voice was rough with it. Nathan shook his hand hard and did not say much, but Carl knew him well enough. April of 1880 arrived with wildflowers on every hillside and the creek running high and clear, and on the 17th of April, Susanna went into labor in the early morning before the sun was up. Doc Haverson arrived within an hour of being sent for, and Rosa Vega arrived 10 minutes after him, because Nathan had stopped at the Vega place first, knowing without having been told that Susanna would want Rosa there. Nathan spent the hours of the labor doing what men of that time and place did in that situation, which was to be outside and be available and try not to think too hard about what was happening inside, which was a nearly impossible instruction. Alejandro came out and sat with him on the porch for a while without talking, which was exactly what Nathan needed. And then Gil Stokes came and said he had the morning chores handled, and nobody needed to worry about the cattle, which was also exactly what Nathan needed. And then it was quiet, and the morning was coming, and the sky was going pink over the hills, and Nathan sat on the porch of his house with his hands on his knees and waited. The sound of the baby crying came through the walls of the house, and Nathan stood up and put his hand on the door, and Rosa opened it from the inside at the same moment and said, "Come in, a boy, both are well." He went in. Susanna was in the bed in the new bedroom that he and Carl had built, and she was exhausted in a way that was visible in every line of her face and beautiful in a way he had not expected. And she was holding a very new and very red and currently very vocal baby boy. And she looked up at Nathan when he came in with the expression of a woman who has just done something extraordinary and knows it. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby and then at her, and found that the words had gone again, the way they did sometimes, except that now he knew she understood when the words went and he did not have to feel ashamed of it. "He is very loud," Nathan said. "He is," Susanna agreed. Her voice was worn and warm. "He is perfect," Nathan said, and this time he meant it with his whole life. "What do you want to name him?" she said. Nathan looked at the baby for a moment. "What do you want to name him?" he said. "I asked first," she said. He looked at her. "James," he said, "after your father." She went very still for a moment, and then she looked down at the baby, and her expression was something he had never seen on her face before, which was a complete and unguarded tenderness with tears in it that she was not trying to stop. "James," she said softly. "James Dalton." Nathan put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they sat in the bedroom that he had built with his own hands and looked at the sun they had made together. And the April morning was coming through the window with its light and its wildflower smell and its absolute indifference to the importance of the moment. And Nathan thought, "I have everything. I have more than I knew how to ask for." James Dalton was a loud and hungry and thoroughly healthy baby who grew fast through the spring and summer of 1880, and who, by the time he was 6 months old, had made his opinions clear on most subjects. He had Susanna's gray eyes and Nathan's dark hair, and a combination of stubbornness from both parents that Doc Haverson, when he came to check on him in October, said would probably serve him very well in life, and would certainly make his parents earn every peaceful hour. Life settled into the rhythms of a working ranch with a young child in it, which is to say that nothing was simple and everything was full. Nathan and Susanna managed their days with the kind of practical teamwork that had characterized everything they did together, Susanna taking the mornings with James while Nathan handled the early livestock work, Nathan taking the evenings with James while Susanna did her books and her reading, and both of them out working the land in the middle of the day when James was sleeping, and the dogs had him watched from the porch, which was a thing the dogs were remarkably good at without being trained for it. The cattle operation grew steadily through 1880 and 1881. Nathan hired a third hand, a young man named Franklin who was 17 and had come down from San Antonio looking for honest work and who had the specific qualities of someone who learns fast and doesn't complain, and who was good with animals in the instinctive way that some people are. Nathan paid him fair wages and made sure he understood that fair wages were what he could expect here, which was not something a young working man in Texas could take for granted in that era. Corbin Marsh, after the failure of his survey claim and the warning from aldermen, turned his ambitions toward properties to the south and east and left Nathan and Susanna largely alone, which was entirely satisfying. He was not a man who had been taught accountability, and he did not learn it, but he had learned that these two particular neighbors were more trouble than they were worth as targets, and that was sufficient. In the spring of 1882, Susanna told Nathan she was pregnant again, this time in the evening on the porch in the last light, and this time Nathan did not sit with it before responding. He put his arm around her and pulled her against his side, and she leaned into him, and they watched the hills go gold, and neither of them said much because not much needed saying. The second child was another boy, born in November of 1882, and they named him Samuel after Nathan's father. Samuel was quieter than James had been as a baby and more observant, lying in his cradle watching everything around him, with an expression of deep consideration that Alejandro said looked exactly like his father at a fence post, which was the funniest thing anyone said all winter, and the comparison was accurate enough that even Nathan laughed. James, who was 2.5 by the time Samuel arrived, received the new baby with the suspicious attention of someone who has been warned that a change is coming, but has not yet worked out what it means. Within 3 weeks, he had appointed himself Samuel's primary protector and could be found sitting next to the cradle on a daily basis, a role he took with complete seriousness and no particular understanding of what it required. Susanna watched this and said, "He is going to be exactly like you when he grows up." Nathan looked at her. "Is that a good thing?" She leaned up and kissed him on the jaw. "It is the best thing," she said. The years that followed were good years. Not without difficulty, because no years in that country were without difficulty. There were dry summers and sick cattle, and a fever that came through the hill country in the winter of 1884, and took 3 people Nathan knew, including old Hector Prout, whose death was a genuine loss to Caldera Flat, and whose widow Mabel received more casseroles than she could eat for 6 months straight, and was genuinely sustained by all of it. There were hard winters and horses that needed replacing and fences that always needed mending, and the general ongoing labor of keeping a working ranch in good order. But there were also the clear October mornings and the spring wildflowers and the Sunday evenings at the Vega house with Alejandro's fiddle and Rose's cooking, and the children running in the yard and growing fast. There were the moments on the porch at dusk when everything went quiet and Nathan and Susanna sat with their coffee and talked, or did not talk, and were equally content with both. There were the mornings when Nathan woke early and lay in the quiet dark and felt Susanna breathing beside him and thought, "This is the thing. This is the thing I was trying to find all those years." James grew into a boy of 6, then 8, then 10, who was quiet and serious and good with animals, who followed Nathan on the ranch with the concentrated attention of someone who is learning everything and storing it. Samuel grew into a boy of 4, then 6, then 8, who was more talkative than his brother and more interested in why things worked the way they did, who asked questions constantly and received answers from both his parents with patience and seriousness, because Nathan and Susanna had agreed early that a child who asked questions should be answered honestly. Susanna continued to run the books for the ranch with the clarity she had always brought to it, and she continued to read everything she could find. And when a lending library was organized in Caldera Flat in 1884 by a group of women that included Rosa Vega and Mabel Prout, Susanna was one of its founders and its most consistent borrower. She also, in the spring of 1885, began teaching the Stokes children to read on Saturday mornings in her kitchen, because Franklin Stokes's young wife had asked if Susanna might, and Susanna said yes without hesitation, and then 2 other families sent their children, and then 3 more, and what began as a Saturday morning reading lesson had become, by the fall of 1885, something very close to a school. Caldera Flat did not have a proper school teacher or a proper schoolhouse. The county had been promising both for years, with the dilatory conviction of an institution that knows it will be asked again. Susanna taught her Saturday classes with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, using the books from the lending library and materials she made herself, and a steadiness of purpose that made the children learn, because they could see that she took their learning seriously, and there is nothing more persuasive to a child than an adult who takes them seriously. Nathan watched this with a pride that was uncomplicated and very large. He watched his wife stand at the front of their kitchen on Saturday mornings with 8, then 12, then 15 children sitting on borrowed chairs and benches around the table and the floor, and he thought about the girl who had grown up in Georgia with a father who read to her, and had carried that love of books across 1,000 miles and a hard marriage and a harder widowhood, and had arrived at this kitchen in this moment, and was doing something genuinely good with it. He told her this one evening, not with a speech but just as a simple statement while they were washing up after supper, and she listened to it with her hands in the wash water and was quiet for a moment and then said, "My father would have liked this country." "I think he would have liked you," Nathan said. She looked at him. "He would have liked you too," she said. "He did not always like men who were easy to read. He respected the ones who had to think before they spoke. Nathan considered this. "Is that a kind way of calling me slow?" "It is a kind way of saying you are worth listening to when you finally say something," she said. He dried his hands and came and put them on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and they stood at the kitchen window looking out at the evening fall across their land, the hills going purple in the last light, the cattle dark shapes in the south pasture, the dogs moving along the east fence line with their precise unhurried patrol. "I have been thinking," he said. "You are always thinking," she said. "I am thinking that the boys should ride the full perimeter with me on Saturday," he said. "James is 10, and it is time he started understanding what he is going to inherit. And Samuel is 7, and he will complain about being left behind." She smiled. He could feel it against his chest where her shoulders moved. "He will," she agreed. "Take them both." "I will," he said, "and when we come back you will have had a morning without any of us in the house." She turned around in his arms to look at him. "Are you offering me a quiet morning as a gift?" "I am." She put her hands on his chest. "Nathan Dalton," she said, "you continue to surprise me." "Good," he said. He kissed her in the kitchen in the falling evening light, and she kissed him back. And it was a kiss that had 2 years of silence in it and 6 years of something better. And he thought that the storm had done him the greatest service of his life, and he was grateful to it in the specific irrational way a man can be grateful to weather. The Saturday came, and Nathan and James and Samuel rode the full perimeter of the Dalton land as he had said, all 4 miles of fence line, through the cedar breaks, and along the limestone ridge and down to the south pasture, and up along the creek and back. James rode his own horse, a steady bay quarter horse named Captain that Nathan had chosen carefully and bought from a rancher in Fredericksburg the previous fall. Samuel rode in front of Nathan on his horse, since his own pony was not up to a 4-mile ride in the way Nathan intended, and sat very straight and asked questions about everything they passed. Nathan answered every question. He pointed out the places where the good grass grew and why, which was about the limestone underneath, and the way the water ran after rain. He showed them the spring in the north pasture, and explained why it had never gone dry in 8 years. He showed them the section of fence he had built himself in 1879, and pointed out the quality of the posts, and why good posts mattered, and how to tell a post that would last from one that would not. He showed them where a hawk nest sat in the big live oak at the northeast corner of the property, and said that it had been there for 4 years, and the same pair came back every spring. James listened to all of it with the serious attention that was his particular quality, and Samuel listened too, and then asked whether the hawks had names, which was such a Samuel question that Nathan laughed, and said that he had not given them names, but that Samuel was welcome too. "Margaret and Henry," Samuel said immediately without hesitation. "Good," Nathan said. "Margaret and Henry it is." When they came back to the house, Susanna was sitting on the porch with her coffee and her book, which was a morning that looked so right to Nathan that he wanted to keep the image of it, and the boys went to her and told her about the perimeter ride in the overlapping, competing way that 2 children tell a story, each trying to get the best parts in, and she listened to both of them simultaneously with the practiced ease of a woman who has had years of experience at it. That evening, Alejandro and Rosa came for supper with their children, who were now teenagers and young adults and who had known James and Samuel since they were born, and the house was full and loud and wonderful. Alejandro brought his fiddle and played after supper, and the younger children danced with the chaotic enthusiasm of children who have not yet learned to be self-conscious about dancing, and the older ones sat with the adults and talked, and Nathan sat at the end of the table and watched all of it. He watched Susanna talking with Rosa about the library, and about a new family that had come to town, and whether the children might come to the Saturday school, and her face was animated in the way it got when she was talking about something that mattered to her. And she was beautiful in the lamplight with James on one side of her arguing something with his cousin, and Samuel on the other side of her showing Alejandro's youngest child, a card trick he had learned from Franklin Stokes. Nathan thought about the morning in November of 1876 when Susanna's barn burned, and he had stood on his side of the fence and done nothing. He thought about 2 years of fence-line conversations that had never quite become what they needed to be. He thought about the November storm of 1878, the lightning and the wind and the rain going horizontal against the windows, and the way the storm had made it impossible to keep being quiet about the only thing that actually mattered. He thought, I have wasted some time and not wasted all of it, and what I have now is more than I had the right to expect, and I am not going to take a minute of it for granted. Alejandro caught his eye from across the table and raised his coffee cup in a small private toast, and Nathan raised his in return, and Rosa noticed this exchange and smiled at her plate, and Susanna noticed all three of them and looked at Nathan with a question in her eyes, and he shook his head slightly, meaning, later, and she accepted that with the trust of a woman who knows that later will come and will be honest. Later, after the Vegas had gone and the boys were in bed and the house had gone quiet, he told her. He sat at the table with the last of the evening's coffee and told her what he had been thinking, all of it, the barn fire and the fence line and the storm and the years since, and she listened with her chin in her hand and her eyes on him in the lamplight. When he finished, she said, I have thought about some of those things too. The storm. Often, she said, because that was the night I understood that I was not only glad you were there because of the weather. He looked at her. When did you know, before that night? She considered this seriously, as she considered most things. The calf, she said. When you came through the fence in the dark to help me pull March and we worked together without talking much, and then you went back and I stood there and watched your lantern going and thought, that was entirely comfortable. I do not have a comfortable hour with most people. She paused. I thought about it for several days after. March, Nathan said, the calf. He is a fine steer now, she said, or he was. He went to market last fall. A fitting end, Nathan said. An important role, she said, and she was smiling. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was a gesture that had been in his body since the November storm, taking her hand, and had not lost any of its importance in all the years since. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. I love you, he said. I am probably not going to stop saying it more often than is strictly necessary. I have never asked you to ration it, she said. I love you, he said again because he could. I love you, Nathan, she said. I have loved you since at least the calf, possibly before. The lamp was burning low, and the house was quiet around them, and outside the spring frogs were starting up along the creek, and the night wind was moving through the cedar breaks, with the soft sound that the hill country made when it was being good to you. And Nathan Dalton sat at his kitchen table in the house that had been Susanna Bristol's and was now theirs, holding his wife's hand in the lamplight, and felt the full weight and rightness of everything that had built to this quiet moment. 2 years of silence had cost him something he could not quite calculate, and had given him something he could not have found another way, because it was the storm that broke the silence and the storm that gave him the words, and without the silence the words would not have meant what they meant. He did not make a philosophy of this. He was not a man who made philosophies of things. He just understood it, sitting there, in the way you understand a thing that is simply true and has always been. In the months that followed, the life of the Dalton ranch continued in the rhythms that good lives make, ordinary and specific, and full of the kind of detail that matters because it is real. James turned 11 and began going to the sale pens with Nathan on cattle sale days, standing beside his father with the same still watchfulness that Nathan had always brought to it, and the buyers started to notice the boy with the steady eyes and the quiet attention. Samuel turned 9 and became, somehow, the source of most of the laughter in their household, a boy of irrepressible wit and curiosity who was going to be something entirely his own. Susanna's Saturday school grew until the county could no longer pretend it did not need a proper schoolhouse, and in the fall of 1886 the county funded a building and sent a young teacher from Austin named Miss Ellie Crane, who was 22 and full of ambition, and who arrived in Caldera Flat and met Susanna Bristol Dalton, and recognized immediately that she was talking to someone who had been doing her job for 2 years and doing it well. And the two of them formed an alliance of mutual respect that was good for every child in the hill country around Caldera Flat. Susanna did not stop teaching on Saturdays. She redirected her Saturdays to the adults in town who wanted to learn to read or to improve their reading, which was a different group with a different need, and more complicated to address and entirely worth the doing. Rosa Vega came to those Saturday mornings, not because she needed to learn to read, but because she wanted to improve her English writing, and because she liked being in Susanna's kitchen on Saturday mornings, and she brought tamales, which meant that the adult literacy class also had the best refreshments of any educational enterprise in Caldera Flat. The spring of 1887 brought good rains and full grass, and the creeks running high and clear, and the wildflowers coming up thick on every hillside, as if the country had decided to make an argument for itself. Nathan rode his fence lines in April with the window of the morning wide open, and the air smelling of cedar and wet limestone and new growth, and he thought about 10 years of this land, and how it had worked on him, and how he had worked on it, and how they had come to a kind of mutual understanding that felt as close to belonging as anything he had ever found. He stopped on the limestone ridge where he had stopped with Alejandro 8 years before, and he looked south over the full spread of the Dalton land, the pastures and the creek line and the tank, and the house and the barn and the garden fence and the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. And he took it all in with the slow attention of a man who knows the value of looking at a thing properly. The wind was from the south, warm and steady, and it brought up the smell of the creek and the distant cattle and the cedar breaks, and somewhere below the ridge a hawk turned in a slow, wide circle on a thermal with the unhurried mastery of something that knows exactly where it belongs. Nathan sat his horse on the ridge and watched the hawk and breathed the good air and listened to the country doing what it did. And then he turned his horse south and rode down the ridge toward home, toward Susanna in the kitchen making coffee with James beside her asking questions about the sale day, and Samuel in the yard, with the dogs running some experiment that would certainly end in someone being muddy. And everything in Nathan Dalton settled into place with the quiet certainty of a man who has stopped carrying what he no longer needs to carry and found that his hands are free and his life is full, and the morning is long and the country is wide and the woman he loves is waiting at the end of the ridge. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.